May 8, 1945. The detention center outside Munich smells of disinfectant and fear. Hundreds of German women stand in processing lines, their Feldgrau uniforms wrinkled and dirty from days of fleeing. Some clutch infants wrapped in Wehrmacht blankets. Others grip the hands of toddlers who haven't eaten properly in weeks. These are the Luftwaffenhelferinnen, the Nachrichtenhelferinnen, female auxiliaries of a defeated Reich. The American sergeant at the desk looks tired. He's been processing surrendered personnel for 72 straight hours. A young mother approaches, her 3-year-old daughter pressed against her hip. She speaks no English. He speaks no German. But the terror in her eyes needs no translation. She's waiting for them to take her child. The interpreter arrives. Forms are stamped. Then comes the phrase that makes her knees buckle. You keep the children with you. She doesn't understand. In the Soviet zones, children are being separated. The propaganda ministry had warned them what the Americans would do. But here now the impossible is happening. The Americans are letting them stay together. The Americans are letting them stay together. A policy that would reshape thousands of lives in the ruins of the Third Reich. By spring 1945, nearly 500,000 German women wore some form of military auxiliary uniform. They weren't combat troops. Nazi ideology forbade women from bearing arms. But they were essential to the Wehrmacht's final desperate operations. The Luftwaffenhelferinnen operated searchlights and radar stations. The Nachrichtenhelferinnen managed communications networks that kept divisions connected across collapsing fronts. The Stabshelferinnen handled administrative duties that freed men for combat. The Wehrmacht had become dependent on them. These women hadn't started the war in uniform. In 1939, German military doctrine kept females strictly in nursing and civilian support roles, but by 1943, catastrophic losses in Russia forced a radical shift. Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring authorized the creation of the Luftwaffenhelferinnendienst in October 1943. Within months, 17-year-old girls were being drafted directly from the Reich Labor Service into military positions. The numbers tell the story of desperation. January 1944, 100,000 female auxiliaries. January 1945, 470,000. By April 1945, some estimates place the figure at over 500,000. They served in every branch except the Kriegsmarine. They wore the uniform. They took the oath. And when the Reich collapsed, they became prisoners of war. But many carried more than just their service records. They carried children. The phenomenon of mothers in uniform reflected the chaos of total war. Some had married fellow soldiers in hurried ceremonies between bombardments. Others were widows whose husbands had fallen on the Eastern Front, drafted despite their maternal status as the Reich scraped its last reserves. Young women who joined at 17 in 1943 were now 20 with infants born in bunkers and field hospitals. Luftwaffenhelferin Margaret Otten, stationed at a flak battery near Hamburg, gave birth to her daughter in February 1945 while Allied bombers flew overhead. Her husband, a Luftwaffe pilot, had been shot down over Belgium 6 months earlier. She returned to duty 3 weeks after delivery, her infant in a makeshift nursery beside the radar equipment. When Hamburg fell, she fled westward with her baby strapped to her chest beneath her greatcoat. The final Wehrmacht report from April 30, 1945, acknowledged that approximately 30,000 female auxiliaries had dependent children with them at their posts. These weren't camp followers or civilians caught in the wrong place. These were uniformed personnel who happened to be mothers, trapped in a categorization the Geneva Convention hadn't fully anticipated. As the fronts collapsed in late April, these women faced impossible choices. In the East, Soviet forces were taking no chances with anyone in German uniform. The Red Army's treatment of female auxiliaries was brutal and widely known. Westward flight became a desperate race. Nachrichtenhelferin Elisabeth Schneider abandoned her communications post in Prague on May 5th, carrying her 2-year-old son 40 kilometers on foot to reach American lines. She'd heard the Americans might be different. The surrender came in waves. May 7 in Reims, May 8 in Berlin, May 9 for remaining forces. Across the crumbling Reich, female auxiliaries emerged from hiding places, bunkers, and administrative buildings. They came with radio codebooks and typewriter ribbons. They came with the stamps and seals of obliterated divisions, and they came with their children. Infants who'd never known peace. Toddlers who could identify aircraft by sound. Children born into the empire of the swastika, who would now grow up in whatever world emerged from its ashes. At collection points from Bavaria to the Rhineland, American forces suddenly faced a situation their training hadn't covered. Processing surrendered Wehrmacht personnel was straightforward. Processing surrendered Wehrmacht personnel who were breastfeeding, that required new thinking. Processing surrendered Wehrmacht personnel who were breastfeeding, that required new thinking. And in the spring of 1945, American military policy was being written in real time. General Dwight D. Eisenhower commanded over 3 million Allied troops in Western Europe. His Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force had prepared extensively for victory, but the scale of German collapse exceeded every projection. Military intelligence had estimated perhaps 2 million prisoners. By May 10, 1945, the Americans alone held 3.4 million. Within weeks, that number would reach 5 million. The fundamental framework was the Geneva Convention of 1929. Article 3 stated that prisoners must be treated with humanity. Article 4 prohibited acts of violence, insults, and public curiosity. Article 10 mandated adequate food and medical care. But the convention had been written primarily with male combatants in mind. The question of dependent children appeared nowhere in its 97 articles. Eisenhower's initial directive, issued April 26, 1945, established the classification of disarmed enemy forces, a controversial designation that sidestepped some Geneva obligations. But by May 8, with journalists touring camps and the world watching, American policy shifted toward full convention compliance. The general's words to his staff were clear. The world will judge us by how we treat the defeated. The challenge was monumental. The Rhineland camps alone held over 1 million prisoners in open fields. Camp Lucky Strike near Le Havre processed 30,000 new arrivals daily. The infrastructure barely existed for adult males. Now camp commanders were reporting pregnant women, nursing mothers, and children as young as 6 weeks. Colonel James Matthews, commanding the detention facility at Heilbronn, filed a report on May 12 that captured the dilemma. We have 847 female auxiliary personnel. Approximately 200 have children present. No provisions exist for pediatric care. Request immediate guidance. The guidance came from an unexpected source. Eleanor Roosevelt had arrived in Germany on May 10th for an inspection tour. Though holding no official military position, her presence carried enormous weight. At Dachau, recently liberated, she'd seen the consequences of family separation. At Buchenwald, she'd walked past the photographs of children torn from parents. Her message to American commanders was unambiguous. We must show we are different. Shaft Directive 129, issued May 14, 1945, formalized what many field commanders had already decided through necessity and conscience. Female military personnel with dependent children would be housed in separate facilities. Children would remain with their mothers. Adequate provisions for pediatric nutrition and medical care would be established immediately. The directive's language was technical, but its meaning was revolutionary in the context of total war's aftermath. The State Department had concerns. Secretary of State Edward Stettinius cabled Eisenhower directly. Soviet representatives question American softness regarding German auxiliary forces. The Soviets had adopted a drastically different approach. In their zones, all German military personnel faced immediate separation from families and transport to labor camps. Children went to state institutions. Mothers might never see them again. Eisenhower's response, dated May 16, revealed both pragmatism and principle. American policy will reflect American values. Furthermore, maintaining family units reduces escape attempts, improves camp order, and facilitates eventual repatriation. This is both moral and practical. The practical considerations were real. Lieutenant Dorothy Thompson, a WAC officer assigned to process female POWs, reported that separated mothers attempted escape at 3 times the rate of those kept with children. Suicide attempts dropped to near zero when families remained intact. Camp discipline improved markedly, but implementation required rapid innovation. The camp at Ludwigsburg converted a former Luftwaffe barracks into the first dedicated facility for mothers with children. Army Medical Corps rushed pediatricians from stateside hospitals. The Red Cross mobilized shipments of infant formula, diapers, and children's clothing. By May 20th, 5 camps had operational nursery facilities. Captain Martha Gellhorn, the war correspondent, visited the Ludwigsburg facility on May 23rd. Her report for Collier's magazine described scenes that would have been unimaginable weeks earlier. American GIs heating infant formula on camp stoves. Army nurses teaching German mothers basic pediatric hygiene. A corporal from Iowa constructing cribs from ammunition boxes while Wehrmacht secretaries looked on in disbelief. The numbers grew rapidly. May 15th, 8,000 female auxiliaries in American custody. May 30, 35,000. June 15th, estimated 60,000 with approximately 15,000 accompanied children. Each represented a story, a choice, a small victory of humanity in the machinery of military administration. The policy wasn't without critics. General George Patton complained it complicated logistics. Some congressmen questioned spending American resources on German children. But Eisenhower held firm. In a staff meeting on May 25th, he stated simply, "History will remember how we treated the helpless. History will remember how we treated the helpless." But for the women standing in those processing lines, history was the least of their concerns. Luftwaffenhelferin Ursula Keller had walked 200 kilometers from Dresden to reach American lines. Her feet bled through the standard-issue boots. Her daughter, barely 2, weighed almost nothing after weeks of starvation rations. The child hadn't cried in days, too weak, too hungry. In Ursula's pocket, wrapped in waxed paper, were 3 photographs. Her husband in his Panzer uniform, her parents' house before the bombing, and her daughter's baptism in better times. The husband was dead at Kursk. The house was ash. Only the child remained. When she reached the detention center at Regensburg on May 11th, Ursula expected the worst. Soviet propaganda had been clear about American brutality. Nazi officers had warned that Americans sold German children to Jewish families for revenge. She'd hidden a piece of broken glass in her sleeve, ready to fight if they tried to take her daughter. The American processing sergeant was 19 years old, from a place called Nebraska. Through the interpreter, he asked for her service record, her unit designation, her rank. Then he looked at the child and asked something unexpected. "Does she have any allergies?" Ursula didn't understand. The interpreter repeated, "For the food. He needs to know if your daughter has allergies for the food ration cards." The broken glass fell from her sleeve. She began to sob. This scene repeated across hundreds of facilities. Nachrichtenhelferin Anna Richter, captured with her infant son near Frankfurt, later testified, "I had prepared myself for anything. Beating, starvation, rape. I had not prepared myself for kindness. When the American nurse gave my son milk, real milk, not the chalk water we'd been mixing, I couldn't stop shaking. It felt like a trick. It had to be a trick. But it wasn't. The mothers in American custody received standard POW rations plus supplementary allowances for children. The International Red Cross documented that nursing mothers at Camp King received 2,800 calories daily, more than many American civilians during rationing. Children received whole milk when available, or powdered milk that arrived by the ton from American dairy cooperatives. Stab Shelfer and Ingrid Muller had served at Wehrmacht headquarters in Munich. Her 3-year-old son had been born in the Führerbunker's shadow in Berlin. His father an SS officer who disappeared during the Soviet assault. She'd fled west with false papers, rejoined a Luftwaffe unit, fled again. By May 14th, she stood before an American lieutenant colonel at the Moosburg detention center. "I told them nothing at first," she wrote years later. "I gave only my auxiliary service number. But when my son developed a fever, the American doctor came immediately. Not eventually, immediately. He gave the medicine himself, checked 3 times during the night. My son's fever broke at dawn. That morning, I told them everything I knew about the headquarters, the codes, the evacuation plans. Not because they forced me, because they saved my child when they didn't have to." The American soldier's Angle Private First Class Robert Davidson from Detroit had killed his first German at Normandy. By the Rhine crossing, he'd stopped counting. His unit had liberated a sub-camp of Dachau in late April. He'd seen the ovens. He'd helped bury the skeletal dead. When assigned to guard duty at the women's detention facility at Augsburg, his orders were simple: maintain security, prevent escapes. But on May 16th, a German infant wouldn't stop crying in Barracks 4. "I wanted to ignore it," Davidson wrote to his mother. "These were the enemy. Their husbands had shot Tommy and Carl and the other boys from our block. But a baby's cry is a baby's cry." The mother was maybe 18. The kid had some kind of rash all over. She was putting tree leaves on it, some German folk medicine thing. Davidson found the medical officer, got sulfur powder, showed the mother how to apply it through the fence wire. The rash cleared in 2 days. The mother tried to give him her wedding ring as payment. He refused. "How could I take it?" He continued in his letter. She had nothing else. And the baby looked like my nephew back home. Same age, same way of reaching for everything. These women, they weren't stormtroopers. They were typists and radio operators who got caught in the wrong uniform. Sergeant William Hayes from Arkansas commanded a guard detail at the Heilbronn facility. A combat veteran with 3 Bronze Stars, he'd fought from Sicily to the Elbe. On May 18th, he discovered 2 German mothers had hidden a 3rd infant, an orphan whose auxiliary mother had died during the westward flight. By the book, "I should have reported it," Hayes recalled in a 1987 interview. "Unregistered personnel, violation of camp regulations. But I looked at that baby, maybe 4 months old, being fed by women who barely had enough for their own children. I logged it as a late registration, made sure it got ration cards. What was I supposed to do? Send an orphan to some bureaucratic nightmare?" The cultural shock ran both directions. These American boys, many still teenagers, found themselves managing facilities that resembled twisted versions of hometown nurseries. Corporal James Mitchell from Ohio wrote, "1 minute you're fighting the Nazi war machine. The next you're warming baby bottles on a camp stove while a bunch of German women in Luftwaffe uniforms watch you like you're from Mars. 1 minute you're fighting the Nazi war machine. The next you're warming baby bottles on a camp stove while a bunch of German women in Luftwaffe uniforms watch you like you're from Mars." And somewhere between Washington and Berlin, policymakers were trying to codify this surreal reality. The Joint Chiefs of Staff Directive 1067, signed by President Truman on May 11, 1945, outlined the occupation's framework: denazification, demilitarization, democratization. but nowhere in its 23 pages did it address lactating prisoners of war. The gap between strategic policy and ground reality had never been wider. Brigadier General Charles Keegan, Deputy Chief of Prisoners of War Affairs, faced the crisis directly. His office in Frankfurt processed hundreds of field reports daily. Each revealed new complications. Female auxiliaries who were 8 months pregnant, teenage Flakhelferinnen with infants conceived during the siege of Berlin, Wehrmacht nurses carrying orphans from destroyed hospitals. On May 19th, Keegan convened an emergency policy conference. Representatives from Chef, the State Department, the Red Cross, and the Judge Advocate General crowded into a former Luftwaffe headquarters. The meeting's transcript, declassified in 1975, reveals the complexity they faced. Gentlemen, we have 12,000 female military prisoners with approximately 3,000 children as of this morning, Keegan began. Moscow has formally protested our treatment as undermining four-power cooperation. Washington wants minimal resources expended on German nationals, and I have camp commanders threatening to resign if we don't provide adequate pediatric care. The legal interpretation came from Colonel David Marcus, a JAG officer who would later help found the Israeli Defense Forces. The Geneva Convention recognizes no distinction between male and female combatants regarding treatment. These women wore uniforms, took oaths, and served in military capacities. They are prisoners of war. Full stop. Their children, however, are civilians under our protection. We cannot punish infants for their parents' allegiance. This interpretation proved crucial. By classifying children as protected civilians rather than prisoners, the Americans could access different resource pools. UNRWA supplies meant for displaced persons could be redirected. Civilian medical personnel could be assigned without violating military protocols. The policy evolved through necessity. Shaft Directive 147, issued May 24th, established 3 categories. Female POWs without dependents would be held in standard facilities. Mothers with children under age 10 would be housed in converted civilian buildings with appropriate amenities. Pregnant POWs would be transferred to designated medical facilities no later than the 7th month. Major Elizabeth Hoffman, Women's Army Corps, was appointed to oversee implementation. Her first inspection report, filed May 28th, was blunt. Current facilities are inadequate but improving rapidly. German mothers initially resist American medical protocols, particularly vaccination requirements. However, compliance increases dramatically when they observe the quality of care provided. The resource allocation was staggering. By June 1st, the American zone had requisitioned 50,000 diapers, 100,000 safety pins, 20 tons of infant formula, and 5,000 cribs. General Lucius Clay, Deputy Military Governor, approved the expenses with a single comment: cheaper than the propaganda value if we fail. The propaganda value was precisely what Joseph Goebbels had counted on, in reverse. For 6 years, Nazi propaganda had painted Americans as Jewish-controlled barbarians who would destroy German culture and enslave its people. The Propaganda Ministerium's final broadcasts in April 1945 warned German women that Americans would steal your children for their Zionist masters. Luftwaffenhelferin Gertrude Brahms had believed every word. Stationed at a communications center near Nuremberg, she'd transcribed Goebbels' final speeches herself. "The Americans are coming to annihilate us," she'd typed again and again. When her unit surrendered on May 2nd, she'd hidden her 6-month-old daughter in a supply closet, hoping to recover her after processing. An American WAC officer found the infant within hours. Instead of punishment, Gertrude received extra rations and a lecture about infant hypothermia. "Everything I'd been told was backwards," she wrote in her 1962 memoir. The monsters were bringing medicine. The barbarians were building nurseries. This cognitive dissonance repeated across thousands of encounters. Nazi propaganda had been so extreme, so divorced from reality, that actual American behavior seemed incomprehensible. Wehrmacht auxiliary Hannelore Fischer, captured near Stuttgart, later testified, "We'd been told Americans would rape us all, sell our children, and work us to death. When they gave my daughter chocolate, real chocolate, I thought I was hallucinating." Radio Moscow seized on the contradiction immediately. Soviet broadcasts into the American zone emphasized the soft treatment of Nazi auxiliaries, while German civilians starved. "American imperialism coddles Wehrmacht mothers while German workers suffer," announced Radio Berlin on May 25th, now under Soviet control. The Americans countered with their own information campaign. Armed Forces Network broadcast testimonies from German mothers in American custody. Photos of well-fed German children in American camps appeared in the Stars and Stripes. General Eisenhower personally authorized journalists to tour the family facilities. Margaret Bourke-White, photographing for Life magazine, captured the defining image on May 30th. An American Army medic examining a German infant while the child's mother, still in her Luftwaffe uniform, looked on with undisguised amazement. The photo would run in newspapers worldwide with the caption, "Democracy's Answer to Totalitarianism." The contrast with Soviet policy became impossible to ignore. Reports filtered west of mass separations in the Soviet zone. German mothers who'd fled east then west again brought stories of children loaded onto trucks, mothers beaten for resisting. The British and French zones generally followed American precedent, but with fewer resources and less consistency. Only in the American zone did the policy achieve full, systematic implementation. Dr. Wilhelm Hübner, future Minister-President of Bavaria, observed in June 1945. "The County Americans are defeating Nazi propaganda more effectively with infant formula than they ever could with bullets. The Americans are defeating Nazi propaganda more effectively with infant formula than they ever could with bullets." But the real victory was being won in processing centers across Bavaria and the Rhineland. One stunned mother at a time, Camp King near Oberursel, had served as the Luftwaffe's primary interrogation center. By May 15, 1945, it housed 3,000 female auxiliaries. The transformation was jarring. Cells that had held Allied airmen now served as nurseries. Interrogation rooms became pediatric examination stations. The supreme irony wasn't lost on Colonel Ernest Hazard, the camp's new commander. "We're literally turning their torture chambers into baby care facilities." The morning of May 20th marked the formal implementation of the family unity policy at Camp King. At 800 hours, loudspeakers announced in German, "All female personnel with dependent children report to Building C for registration. Children will remain with mothers." Nachrichtenhelferin Margaret Zimmermann didn't believe it. She'd hidden her 18-month-old son with civilian relatives outside Frankfurt, planning to retrieve him after determining American intentions. Now they were announcing she could have kept him all along. She approached the registration desk with visible skepticism. Master Sergeant Anthony Rizzo from Brooklyn handled registration. Through the interpreter, he explained the process. Mothers would be housed in separate barracks with enlarged spaces. Children would receive full ration cards. Medical examinations would begin immediately. Zimmerman kept waiting for the catch. There had to be a catch. "When can I see my son?" she asked. "Bring him tomorrow," Rizzo replied. "We'll process him as your dependent. You're not taking him?" "Lady, we got enough problems without separating kids from their mothers." The exchange, recorded by a Stars and Stripes reporter present that day, exemplified hundreds of similar conversations. By noon, over 400 mothers had registered. By evening, the camp's motor pool was dispatched to retrieve children from hiding places across a 30-mile radius. The Darmstadt facility, designated Camp 91, presented different challenges. It held predominantly Luftwaffe Flakhelferinnen, anti-aircraft auxiliaries who defended industrial targets. These women were younger, many drafted at 17, now barely 20. Of the 2,100 female prisoners, approximately 300 had infants under 1 year old, babies conceived during the war's final desperate year, often with fathers now dead or missing on the Eastern Front. Captain Dorothy Marshall, a WWII officer assigned to organize the facility, faced an immediate crisis on May 22. 30 infants had developed diarrhea simultaneously, potentially fatal in 1945's medical context. The camp's German doctor, a former Wehrmacht physician, diagnosed contaminated water. But the American water supply was clean. Investigation revealed the mothers had been mixing formula with creek water, not trusting the American supply. They'd been told for years that Americans would poison German children. Even facing their infant's illness, propaganda's grip held firm. Marshall ordered a demonstration. In the mess hall before 200 German mothers, she mixed formula with camp water and fed it to the abandoned German infant the facility had unofficially adopted. Then she drank a full glass herself. "Your children are safe here," she announced in broken German. "We are not your enemy anymore." The silence broke when Luftwaffenhelferin Elsa Hartmann stood up. Her twin daughter, 6 months old, had been born in an underground bunker, while B-17s leveled Darmstadt above. She walked to the water station, filled a cup, and gave it to her daughters. One by one, other mothers followed. The medical crisis passed within 48 hours. All 30 infants recovered. But more importantly, the psychological barrier had cracked. Camp 91's daily report for May 24 noted, "Mothers increasingly cooperative with American medical protocols." At Ludwigsburg, the first purpose-built family facility, the transformation was most complete. The former Luftwaffe barracks had been redesigned in 1 week by Army engineers. Partition walls created family cubicles. A former aircraft hangar became a combined nursery and playground. The motor pool garage was converted into a pediatric clinic. The facility's first commander, Major James Patterson, had 3 children back in Cincinnati. His approach was pragmatic. "I ran it like I'd want my wife and kids treated if things were reversed." Simple as that. On May 25th, Ludwigsburg received its highest-profile prisoners. 12 female auxiliaries from Hitler's personal communications staff, captured at Berchtesgaden. Among them was Stabshelferin Christa Schroeder, not the famous secretary but a 22-year-old communications specialist who shared the name. She carried her 3-week-old daughter, born in the Alpine fortress as the Third Reich died around them. The processing should have been routine. But Schroeder's daughter was critically ill, premature, underweight, struggling to breathe in the warm May air. The camp's pediatrician, Captain David Weinstein, himself a Jewish refugee who'd fled Germany in 1936, faced an ethical test that transcended medicine. Weinstein worked for 14 straight hours. He requisitioned an oxygen tent from a field hospital. He administered the new miracle drug penicillin. He monitored the infant personally through the night. On May 26, the child's breathing stabilized. She would survive. Schroeder, who typed orders for the final solution, whose unit had coordinated the logistics of genocide, watched a Jewish doctor save her child's life. Years later, in a 1973 interview, she would say only, "Everything I believed was proven wrong in that moment. Everything. Everything I believed was proven wrong in that moment. Everything." And across the American zone, thousands of similar moments were shattering 6 years of carefully constructed hatred. May 26, 1945, Regensburg Detention Center. Corporal Eugene Bradley from Mississippi, was distributing afternoon rations when he noticed a German auxiliary trying to hide in the food line. Luftwaffenhelferin Ilse Hoffmann had already received her portion, but was attempting to get another. Bradley had seen this before, prisoners hoarding food, still convinced starvation was imminent. He pulled her aside. Through hand gestures and broken German, he discovered she wasn't hoarding for herself. Her infant daughter couldn't digest the standard formula. Hoffmann had been trading her entire ration to other mothers for the few spoonfuls of breast milk they could spare. Bradley had a sister back home with a newborn. He knew what hungry babies sounded like. Against regulations, he walked Hoffmann to the medical tent himself. The doctor prescribed a special soy-based formula for lactose intolerance. When Hoffmann realized her daughter would receive specialized medical care, the kind even wealthy Germans couldn't access during the war, she collapsed. She just sat on the ground crying. Bradley wrote in his diary, "Not sad crying. Like relief crying. Like she finally believed we weren't going to hurt them. Made me think about all the things they must have been told about us. The human encounters transcended language barriers." At Camp King on May 27th, Private First Class Joseph Tanaka from California was assigned guard duty. Tanaka, whose own parents were in Manzanar internment camp, found himself guarding women who'd served the regime that allied with Japan. The irony was overwhelming. A young Nachrichtenhelferin approached his post carrying twins, perhaps 4 months old. She spoke no English. He spoke no German, but she kept pointing to the infants, then to her eyes, clearly distressed. Tanaka fetched the medical officer. Both babies had developed conjunctivitis, pink eye, potentially blinding if untreated. As the doctor applied antibiotic ointment, the mother noticed Tanaka's name tag. "Japanese?" she asked in accented English. He nodded. She looked confused, then gestured at his American uniform. Through the interpreter, she said, "But Japan is Germany's ally. Why do you wear their uniform?" "Because I'm American," Tanaka replied. The concept that someone of Japanese ancestry could be American, could fight for America, could guard German prisoners with fairness and dignity, it challenged everything the racial state had taught her. She stared at him for a long moment, then bowed deeply, a gesture that transcended European custom. The most stunning reactions came during medical examinations. Wehrmacht auxiliary Maria Wegner had served at a communications post in Munich. Her 2-year-old son had been born with a clubfoot, a condition that under Nazi eugenics policy marked him as lebensunwertes Leben, life unworthy of life. She'd hidden his disability for 2 years, binding his foot, never letting doctors examine him. On May 28th at the Augsburg detention facility, the American medical inspection was mandatory. Dr. Robert Morrison, an orthopedic surgeon from Boston, examined the child. Wegner waited for the words she'd dreaded, defective, useless, euthanasia. Instead, Morrison said through the interpreter, "This is completely correctable. We'll start treatment immediately." Wegner didn't understand. "But he's damaged," she said, using the Nazi terminology. "He's a child with a medical condition," Morrison replied. "We fix medical conditions. That's what doctors do." The treatment began that afternoon. Casts, exercises, the promise of future surgery if needed. Wegner watched American medical personnel treating her defective son with the same care they gave to healthy children. Everything the racial hygiene laws had proclaimed, everything about superior and inferior humans, it crumbled in the face of basic medical ethics. Lieutenant Sarah Coleman, a nurse from Chicago, documented these encounters in letters home. You can actually see the moment their worldview breaks. It's in their eyes. They've been told we're monsters, that will hurt their children, that we represent everything evil. Then we give them medicine, food, safety. Some of them just stand there shaking. The most documented reaction occurred on May 30th at Camp 91. A new arrival, Stabshelferin Anna Richter had walked 150 kilometers from Czechoslovakia carrying her 10-month-old daughter. The child was severely malnourished, barely responsive. Richter approached the registration desk like a condemned prisoner. Sergeant Michael O'Brien from Boston processed her paperwork. When he saw the infant's condition, he immediately called for medical assistance. Within minutes, the child was receiving intravenous fluids. Richter stood frozen, unable to process what was happening. "Why?" she finally asked through the interpreter. "She's just another German baby. Why do you care?" O'Brien, whose unit had liberated Nordhausen concentration camp 4 weeks earlier, whose best friend had died in Normandy, looked at the skeletal infant and said, "Because she's a baby." "Politics don't apply to babies." The translator repeated the words. Richter stared at O'Brien for a long moment. Then she did something that shocked everyone present. She snapped to attention and gave a formal Wehrmacht salute. Not to the Third Reich, but to the American sergeant who'd just saved her child. O'Brien, embarrassed, simply nodded and returned to his paperwork. Stars and Stripes reporter James McGraw witnessed the exchange. His article, published June 2, 1945, concluded, "In that moment you could see the entire Nazi ideology collapse in one woman's eyes. 12 years of racial theory, of master race propaganda of us versus them, defeated by simple human decency. In that moment, you could see the entire Nazi ideology collapse in one woman's eyes. 12 years of racial theory, of master race propaganda, of us versus them, defeated by simple human decency. Now came the harder task, building new routines in the ruins of old certainties." By June 1, 1945, the American zone operated 15 facilities specifically designated for female POWs with children. Daily life in these camps defied every expectation of military detention. At 0600 hours, instead of military reveille, the sounds were crying infants and mothers preparing morning feeding. The surreal had become routine. Camp King established the model schedule. Breakfast at 0700. Mothers received 2,400 calories. Nursing mothers 2,800. Children proportional rations based on age. The food itself shocked the Germans. White bread, real butter, occasional eggs. Luftwaffenhelferin Ingrid Muller wrote, "We ate better as prisoners than we had as soldiers in the war's final year." After breakfast came mandatory health inspections. American medical personnel examined every child daily in the first weeks, checking for malnutrition, disease, developmental issues. The meticulous attention initially frightened mothers who interpreted it as selection for separation. But as days passed without children disappearing, fear gave way to gratitude. Captain Helen Morrison, chief nurse at Ludwigsburg, instituted mothers' classes at 1,000 hours. German mothers, many barely out of their teens, learned basic nutrition, hygiene, and childhood disease prevention. The lessons used captured Wehrmacht medical supplies and American Red Cross materials. The irony wasn't subtle. American nurses teaching German mothers to care for German children using German medical supplies that the Nazi regime had hoarded while civilians suffered. The afternoon activity period revealed the most profound transformations. At Darmstadt's Camp 91, Army engineers had constructed a playground from tank parts and ammunition boxes. Swings hung from former anti-aircraft gun mounts. A sandbox occupied a bomb crater. Children who'd known only air raid sirens and explosions were learning to play again. Sergeant Antonio Rodriguez from San Antonio supervised playground construction at 3 facilities. "These kids didn't know how to be kids," he reported. 3-year-olds would freeze when planes flew over. Toddlers knew to find cover at loud noises. We had to teach them that noise didn't always mean danger. The evening routine brought unexpected challenges. German mothers maintained strict Wehrmacht discipline with their children. Silence at meals, rigid posture, immediate obedience. American guards found it unsettling. Private Leonard Washington from Detroit wrote home, "These 2-year-olds march in formation to dinner. It's creepy as hell." Gradually, military rigidity softened. By mid-June, children were laughing at mealtimes. Mothers began singing lullabies instead of patriotic songs. The transformation was deliberate. WWII Lieutenant Dorothy Hayes, a child psychologist in civilian life, advised camp commanders, "Every normal childhood behavior these children exhibit is a small defeat for Nazi indoctrination." The medical miracles continued daily. At Regensburg, American doctors performed cleft palate surgery on a Luftwaffenhelferin's son, a procedure unavailable to German civilians during the war. At Augsburg, premature twins received incubator care that saved both lives. At Camp King, a 3-year-old with tuberculosis began treatment with streptomycin, just released for military use. Stabshelferin, Elisabeth Kraus had served at Wehrmacht headquarters in Berlin. Her daughter, born in 1943, had never seen a doctor. Kraus feared the child's slight developmental delays would mark her for euthanasia under T4 protocols. At Ludwigsburg, American doctors diagnosed mild hearing loss, easily correctable with treatment. "They gave my daughter a future," Kraus testified in 1962. The Americans, who we'd been told were uncultured barbarians, provided medical care the master race had denied its own children. The camps developed unexpected communities. Mothers shared childcare duties across former unit lines. Luftwaffe and Wehrmacht auxiliaries, who'd maintained strict service separation during the war, now washed diapers side by side. A former SS auxiliary helped a communist political prisoner's child learn to walk. The artificial divisions of the Nazi state dissolved in the face of maternal necessity. Food distribution became a particular point of wonder. Children received chocolate, real Hershey bars from American rations. Fresh milk arrived daily when available. Orange juice, unknown to most German children, appeared weekly. Mothers who'd mixed sawdust into bread to stretch rations now watched their children gain weight on American supplies. Nachrichtenhelferin Hedwig Bauer, captured with her infant at Passau, kept a diary throughout her detention. Her entry for June 10th reads, "My son smiled today." Really smiled. Not from gas or reflex, but happiness. He has never been this healthy. We are prisoners, but we are more free than we were under our own flag. The statistics told the story. By June 15th, infant mortality in the camps had dropped to 2.1%, lower than in German civilian hospitals. Childhood diseases were treated immediately. Malnutrition reversed within weeks. The camps designed for detention had become centers of healing. The camps designed for detention had become centers of healing. But by late June 1945, pressure mounted to empty these facilities and return German women to a society that barely existed anymore. General Lucius Clay, military governor of the American Zone, faced an impossible equation. 4 million German refugees were flooding westward. Every major city lay in ruins. Food distribution systems had collapsed. And now he needed to release 60,000 female auxiliaries and 15,000 children into this chaos. The Joint Chiefs wanted the camps empty by September. The Germans had nowhere to go. The repatriation process began July 1, 1945. Priority went to mothers with children under age 2 and pregnant women in their final trimester. Each released prisoner received discharge papers, 2 weeks of rations and travel permits to their declared destinations. What they didn't receive was any guarantee those destinations still existed. Luftwaffenhelferin. Margaret Hoffmann was released from Ludwigsburg on July 5. Her hometown of Pforzheim had been 83% destroyed in a February bombing raid. Her husband was missing on the Eastern Front. Her parents were dead. She stood at the camp gates with her 18-month-old daughter, discharge papers in hand with literally nowhere to go. Master Sergeant Frank Coleman, processing releases, noticed her paralysis. Through the interpreter, he learned her situation. Against regulations, he arranged transportation to a refugee center in Stuttgart and added extra rations to her pack. "What else could I do?" he wrote. "Send her out to starve?" This scene repeated thousands of times. The American military, prepared for combat and occupation, found itself managing a humanitarian crisis. Camp commanders began coordinating with German civilian authorities, where they existed, to arrange housing and employment for released mothers. The integration challenges were immense. These women had served the defeated regime. Many German civilians blamed them for prolonging the war. In numerous documented cases, released auxiliaries faced violence from Germans who'd lost everything. The uniform they'd worn with pride now marked them as collaborators. Nachrichtenhelferin Anna Weber was released to Munich on July 12th. Within a week, neighbors had discovered her service record. Someone painted Nazi whore on her door. Her 2-year-old son was refused entry to a kindergarten. The ration board lost her paperwork 3 times. She survived only because an American chaplain, Father Timothy O'Brien, intervened with military authorities. But the most profound consequences were psychological. These women had experienced something impossible under Nazi ideology. Their enemies had treated them with greater humanity than their own government ever had. The cognitive dissonance shaped a generation. Dr. Friedrich Meinecke, the German historian, interviewed dozens of former auxiliaries in 1946. His notes, published posthumously, reveal consistent patterns. They speak of the Americans with something approaching reverence. Not Stockholm Syndrome, but genuine bewilderment that their enemies proved more civilized than their leaders. The children themselves became living testimonies to American policy. By August 1945, German newspapers, now under Allied control, published photographs of healthy German children who'd been in American custody. The images contradicted every piece of Nazi propaganda about Allied intentions. German mothers who'd hidden their children in forests and cellars, believing American brutality was certain, saw pictures of well-fed German infants in American camps. The long-term effects rippled through German society. When the Federal Republic formed in 1949, many former female auxiliaries became vocal supporters of democracy and Western alliance. Luftwaffenhelferin-turned-politician Margarete Kissel stated in a 1952 Bundestag speech, "The Americans showed us democracy not through words but through actions. They treated our children as human beings when our own ideology had classified some as subhuman." The policy influenced occupation dynamics throughout. 1945-1949, German cooperation with American denazification efforts was notably higher in areas where former auxiliaries had been released. These women, having experienced American humanity firsthand, became inadvertent ambassadors for democratization. Soviet propaganda attempted to weaponize the contrast. Radio Moscow broadcast testimonies from German mothers separated from children in Soviet camps, blaming the Americans for weakening socialist solidarity. But the message backfired. Germans in the Soviet zone fled westward in increasing numbers, specifically citing family separation policies. By September 1945, all female auxiliary camps had closed. The last facility at Regensburg released its final 230 mothers and 67 children on September 14th. The commanding officer's final report noted, "Mission accomplished without a single child fatality under American custody." The numbers were staggering in retrospect. Between May and September 1945, American forces had processed approximately 62,000 female German military auxiliaries. An estimated 15,000–18,000 children had passed through the camps. The infant mortality rate had been lower than in American civilian hospitals. Not a single documented case existed of forced family separation. Not a single documented case existed of forced family separation. In the moral arithmetic of the 20th century's most devastating war, this fact stands as more than a statistical footnote. It represents a choice of perhaps thousands of individual choices that would echo through history in ways no military strategist could have predicted. The women who stood in those processing lines in May 1945 had served a regime that industrialized murder, that separated millions of families forever in concentration camps and killing fields. They'd worn the uniform of an ideology that classified humans by race, that deemed some children worthy of life and others destined for death. They expected their conquerors to reflect their own system's cruelty back upon them. Instead, they met 19-year-old boys from Iowa who heated baby formula on camp stoves. They encountered Jewish doctors who saved the children of women who typed orders for the Holocaust. They found a democracy that, even in victory's exhaustion, even with Dachau's images fresh in memory, chose to see infants as infants rather than enemies. This wasn't naive idealism. Eisenhower and his commanders understood the strategic value of humane treatment. Every mother reunited with her child was a refutation of Nazi propaganda. Every healthy German baby in American care undermined Soviet claims of Western barbarity. Humanity proved more powerful than any information campaign. But perhaps the deepest significance lies in what didn't happen. In a world where violence begets violence, where cycles of revenge consume generations, the Americans broke the pattern, not through grand gestures or official proclamations, but through mundane acts of decency. A sergeant sharing his chocolate ration with a hungry child, a nurse teaching a teenage mother to treat diaper rash, an engineer building playground swings from tank parts. These moments multiplied thousands of times, created something unprecedented. Former enemies who remembered their captors with gratitude rather than hatred. Children who grew up knowing that the men who defeated their fathers had saved their lives. In the ruins of total war, when civilization itself seemed to have collapsed, the choice to keep mothers and children together was a declaration that some values transcend victory and defeat. It was proof that even in humanity's darkest chapters, the light of basic decency could not be entirely extinguished. The German mothers who were stunned when Americans let them keep their children witnessed something more than military policy. They witnessed democracy's ultimate answer to fascism, not just defeating it on the battlefield, but refusing to become it in victory.